Well, good morning, St. Paul. Glad that you're joining us on this midweek Bible study on the book of Acts. I hope that you've had a Good weekend and the beginning of a good week this week. We definitely miss seeing you up here at the church, but glad that you're here. Um, okay, there we go. I think I'm on. But glad you're here. Logan Ogletree is with me, and hopefully, as you sign on either through our church platform or another means, that you get some level of a greeting. If you're new to this particular Bible study, we try to interact as best as we can via online ministries. So if you have questions or comments, it should be, if you're looking at your screen, maybe down at the bottom right, you can just type those in, and Logan will be glad to field those. Now, it takes about 2 minutes of a delay, but eventually can get it back to me. Also, if you are new to this class and you would like to participate in this particular class's prayer ministry, one of the things that we do each week is we share concerns. If we were in a live format, then obviously we would share concerns around the room, but since we're in the COVID-19 sort of environment, we're doing this electronically. So if we have your email and you receive emails on behalf of the class, feel free. You should be receiving an email from Betty Hips. She is quarterbacking this for us. Feel free to share whatever concerns that you're comfortable with. And then that'll be dispersed to the entire group so that throughout the week we can carry these burdens together in prayer. However, if you're new, if you would email St. Paul, and you can just email Kathy at stpaulunitedmethodist.com, and she'll be glad to share requests with you. I think these are the announcements on, at least when it comes to the class. I do want to give you some announcements on behalf of our congregation. This particular Sunday for us, July 5th, is Communion Sunday. One of the traditions of our church is that we celebrate communion on the first Sunday of each month. So what we would like for you to do is, if you haven't already done this, please purchase some bread and maybe some grape juice or something along those lines. Go ahead and set it aside in your house. The idea of setting it aside is to treat it differently than the common, because we're going to use those in communion together on our Sunday worship. At the end of the service, we'll take communion together. I know that we're separated just because of the pandemic, but the great thing about our faith and the thing about about God is that God can be in all places at all time. And so as we celebrate communion here inside the sanctuary, and then as you, for just those that are participating in the service, and then for those that are worshiping at home, or if you're with a watch party, maybe with a couple of other people, do want you to have some elements set aside for that so that you can share in communion together. So that's the first announcement for July 5th. We are tentatively, and I use the word tentative, we are scheduled for a live worship, one worship service at 11 o'clock on July 12th. That's not this coming Sunday, but it'll be Sunday week. That is our plan. We've been working towards this now for a number of months. Now, the reason why I use the word tentative is because it is subject to, obviously, what's going on inside of our community. One of the things that we do, I think it averages out to be about every 3 days or so, as we contact maybe a different health professionals or maybe some of the city officials to get an idea with where our community sits when it comes to hospitalizations, particularly around ICU bed capacity levels, and medical professional, the capacity, their levels. Obviously, if you could have bed capacity and a medical professional become sick, and then obviously if you don't have people to care for those that are sick, then it doesn't matter how many beds you have. So we are watching those numbers. As long as those numbers still have margin, and what I mean by margin is that the need for those types of either beds or services is less than the demand for those is less than the supply. So as long as we're good that level, or on that level when it comes to margin, then we will have a live worship service. If for any reason, whether that be leading into July 12th or if the rise in cases, say in 5 weeks, hits a level to where that margin is at a critical level, then we'll suspend live worship until those numbers are just more convenient for hospitals and for us. We want to be a helper of the community, not one that harms the community. But as of right now, as of today, there is plenty of margin for us, at least inside the Columbus community. And so we are planning for one live worship service under strict social distancing guidelines for July 12th. Now, what I mean about social distancing guidelines is that, and this is true for whenever, if you do come to St. Paul, even now, our administrative office is open from 9 to 2, Monday to Friday. Our preschool is open with a reduced enrollment. Both of those are under strict social distancing guidelines, which means that you cannot enter our building without a mask. Now, preschool has their own guidelines that are directed by the state, and it's stricter than us on the administrative side, just with when it comes to dropping off children or babies, and then what levels of involvement that they might be able to participate in our preschool. But if you come to the office on the administrative side or on the church side, you are required to wear a mask. There are certain places that the public has access to, and then certain places that they do not. The common areas, obviously, we do, but in individual offices and things like that, we do not. That is, the public does not. You are required to wash your hands on the way in. You are required to wear a mask the whole time, and then to wash your hands on the way out. Now, saying that, this is our second week of reopening our office area, and a small selection of Bible studies that have maybe 10 or 12 people or less, 15 max in their study. It's under strict social distancing guidelines as well. And what we're doing now, and what we'll continue to do as we seek to reopen, we'll evaluate each from week to week, or maybe in 3-week intervals, to see how St. Paul is doing, as in us as a staff, and how well we're managing our campus and what have you, but then also in light of what our community is doing. And again, any time that there's the margin between the ability to care for those that are sick or are infected by the COVID-19 virus, when it comes to hospitals and hospital staff, if that margin gets to a critical level, then we will actually pause our reopening process and allow those numbers to go back down for a period of time. In the meantime, and this could be months, it could be maybe even up to a year and a half. You probably have heard as much news as I have on this about how long we'll be living in this pandemic type environment. We will offer online ministries, and we'll offer to some degree whatever live ministries we can do in a safe and healthy way. So if you're uncomfortable with either live worship or you're uncomfortable with a live study, then we want to respect that. We want to honor that, and we want to give you a means to grow in your faith through whatever technologies that we're able to do. So with that, whether it be in worship, whether it be Bible study, we want you to be connected. Obviously, this is a way that you can be connected through our Bible study, and we'll continue to do this and some level of live event as long as it's healthy for our community. But you have to wear a mask. When we worship, it'll be social distance. The sanctuary actually will be blocked off on where people can and can't sit. You'll enter in through the main entrance of the sanctuary, not the side entrances or anything like that. We'll ask you to wash your hands on the way in through one of the sanitizing areas, and then you will just enter the sanctuary. We want to fill the sanctuary from the pews closest to the pulpit or the lectern, and then work our way back. So one of the great gifts that you might be able to give to someone else is the ability to sit where you normally would sit if we were in just a normal world. So there's going to be some changes, at least in the meantime. And then if the sanctuary reaches a maximum capacity for what we're able to hold inside of the guidelines, then we have a place for simulcast on our campus, and we'll do that for a number of weeks and evaluate and see how we're going. So sort of in this reopening process, as I think everybody else is trying to figure that out as well. But just want to give you some updates there. If you have any specific questions about that, if you would, please, you can email those in or send them in via the chat, and we can address those as they come in. If you would rather do this privately, you can contact the church office, or you can either reach out to me or to Kathy or to John or anybody that would be that you're comfortable with talking about our reopening procedures and at least schedule. All right, I think that's all the announcements. So if you would, where you are at this moment, if you would, please bow your heads, and we'll ask God to be with us in our time of study. Oh God, as we gather in your name, even though we are separated geographically, we count on the ability of your Spirit, who has this ability to reach into our time and space and to bring about transformation. What we seek to do here at St. Paul is to provide an environment where people grow in their faith. We think that happens when they experience certain catalysts, and one of those catalysts is study. And so use this time of study. We're after an applied sense of learning where it's not just we learn what the text says, we want it to be a part of our life, which means we count on the Holy Spirit in order to do that, so that in the end, what's produced is a growth in faith, that we mature. To use Paul's language, we grow into adulthood when it comes to our faith, so that people will see more and more the nature of Christ inside of us. So for each of us, that's going to look different. For some people, it will be an empowerment is what is needed. For others, an encouragement. For then some still, a conviction. All of this, oh God, what we want is to give ourselves to you with our hearts, with our minds, in such a way that people see the living Christ inside of us. And from that, then, they experience Jesus for themselves. So use us, oh God, use this time, however you may use it, in a way that benefits you. And we pray this now in your name. Amen. All right, so in our study, we are in the middle of chapter 23. We just have a few more chapters left, I think about 5 chapters left. And maybe within the next 2 weeks, hopefully can reach the end. A little bit about where we're at in the book of Acts. The information that shows up around chapter 23 through the rest of the chapter is different to some degree than what is our previous weeks. And in the beginning of Acts, you get some historical information. Paul or Peter, they traveled from A to B, but you get a fair amount of either theological reflection or some level of they did something in a physical action, but it has a great deal of theological implications. When we get to chapter 23, and that'll be through 28, the information is, as in the information of travel, that type of narrative of just event A, event B, event C, event D, it comes quickly. And so we're able to cover large portions of the Scripture because it's either a retelling of something that's already happened, or it is Luke just catching us up to speed for how Paul will go from Jerusalem in chapter 23 all the way to Rome in chapter 28, or at least scheduled to go to Rome. So, and so you'll see even today, we have a fast clip, hopefully for today. We're going to pick up where we left off, which is in around the first, maybe verse 11 of chapter 23. And then if all things go well, we'll get into chapter 25. And now, just because that's going to be a fair amount of information, as in chapters to cover, it is not as much as one would think, just because of what Luke is doing. And I think you'll get this once we start getting into the text. Now, saying that, if there's ever anything that's unclear, or if there's something that is confusing, or you have questions about any of the text, we want to stop there, because learning is not just the digestion of the information, as into kind of taking it in. What we want is for comprehension. And so just because we have a schedule, it doesn't mean that we always follow it. Some of you that have been in my studies before, you're aware of that. That seems to be weekly. So, recap from last week. Paul, this is back a number of chapters before, has been visiting different churches. He's traveled all the way from Jerusalem up into Galatia, that area. He's traveled over into Greece, Thessalonica, and then down south, eventually to Athens. He's moved up to Corinth, and then he's moved over to Ephesus, and then he sort of did another circle back to check on other places. The whole time he's preaching the gospel, and at the whole time he's raising an offering. The offering eventually will go back to Jerusalem, which brought him back to Jerusalem back in chapter 22 and 23. Or really 22. So he's still in Jerusalem. Remember, he arrives in Jerusalem, chapter 22. He eventually meets with the church leaders. They asked him to do some things out of humility to hopefully win the peace between Paul and at least some of the Judaizers that follow him around and stir up trouble. So he did this. There was 4 of his disciples or companions that did this as well. So and hoping that would appease some of the Judaizers, that Paul is not against them, and so then perhaps can participate in some level of ministry like he did in previous places. We know that did not work from last week, chapter 22. That eventually, I think in the text it calls them Jews from Asia. They do come, they do say certain things. Some of those a great deal of those are either exaggerations or just flat out lies about Paul. And that led to a riot. The tribune was able to step in, and he rescued Paul. Eventually found out that Paul was a Roman citizen. And so that's sort of where we left it. The next morning, after Paul was semi-arrested, he was arrested and then actually quarantined just for safety reasons. The tribune called to order the Sanhedrin, which is the religious ruling Supreme Court of that particular time. There's an interchange between Paul and the Sanhedrin. Eventually, the Sanhedrin is split over the issue of resurrection. That's what we find in chapter 23, verses 1 through 10. And so basically, Sadducees, and this is sort of a recap of other places in Acts, not just in chapter 23. Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection of the dead. Pharisees did believe in the resurrection of the dead. So Paul is in the Pharisee camp, obviously, and so there's a division amongst that group, and so there's no consensus about what to do with Paul, which is where we find at the end in chapter 23 at the end of verse 10. So a little bit of a recap from last week to catch us up to speed, and we're going to jump back in. So if you got your Bibles, if you don't, you can look at the screen. The text should pop up at the bottom of the screen, and you can follow along accordingly. Now, I do want to stop at verse 11 because this is a critical verse in Acts chapter 23. Now, Paul the Sanhedrin has just met. They are split, and so Paul is taken back into the barracks for safekeeping. And then verse 11 says, "The following night the Lord stood by him and said, 'Take courage, for as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify also in Rome. Now, this is not the first time that Paul has had these levels of inward encouragement or maybe visions or some level of entertainment with the Holy Spirit. And in verse 11 we have where the risen Lord obviously appeared to Paul in some form or fashion, and it shows up in these critical moments. It happened in chapter 18, verse 9. It also happened in chapter 22, verse 17. So this is the third time. And if you go back and look at Paul's ministry, and I think this is really, really important for us too, because we can make application to our own life here, that before it's normally those visitations by God for encouragement steady Paul for the next leg of struggle. And so there's a level where God is fortifying Paul inwardly for what's about to happen. This is assurance for Paul, and I mean, as we know in chapter 18, as we know in chapter 22, and also what we'll see in today's lesson, this assurance meant so much to Paul during this time of delay, because he's going to be in prison for a little bit. At the same time, the anxieties that come with that. And if you look at Paul, at least we can get some insight of Paul. And we look at, Paul's going to give a couple of different defenses that we'll see, particularly in 24. And then if we get all into 25 as well, Paul does not see himself as a victim. Paul actually sees himself as a victor. And I think this is really, really important for us today, because one of the things I think God constantly wants to do is to prepare us for even things that we cannot see. It's amazing how God will do levels of preparation inside the life of a person, and they really don't know why or what's going on, and they're not able to see that until either they get in the middle of the storm, or sometimes even when they get they pass through the storm and they're able to look back and see what God was doing the whole time. These moments of clarity and insight become energy and strength for us to carry on even inside of struggle. And I think this is a turning point to some degree in the narrative of Luke, where Paul has always been a determined person, but if you can see, if you go back and look in chapter 18, look in chapter 22, and then also now in 23, you see these little turning points that take place in his life where God is equipping, God is strengthening, God is encouraging. There's a word there that is mentioned in the text that says, it either say you will testify. I think some of your Bibles might say testify. Some of your Bibles might say witness. That has a similar meaning or root in its wording to actually the word martyr. So it's a little tidbit there with when it comes to wording, that the idea of witness, the idea of testifying, actually is very similar to martyrdom. Now, that's not like a foreshadowing of what's going to happen to Paul. We do know what happens to Paul. He is martyred, but you can just see that these inward times of where God fortifies us often is used for some level of witness in the future. And we need those. So it's just interesting. It's not just Paul that God does this to. I mean, God does this in our own life, but we definitely can draw strength from Paul's life. But verse 11, if you're a highlighter or an underliner, you want to highlight that, because this will strengthen Paul for the next 2 to 3 years of his life, as he's eventually going to wind up headed to Rome. And it's not an easy journey. It comes with all types of struggle and all types of anxieties. All right, so our next passage is, if you're following along in your Bible, verse 12 through 15. When it was day, the Jews made a plot and bound themselves by an oath neither to eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. There were more than 40 who made this conspiracy. They went to the chief priests and elders and said, "We have strictly bound ourselves by an oath to taste no food till we have killed Paul. Now therefore you, along with the council, give notice to the tribune to bring him down to you, as though you were going to determine his case more exactly. And we are ready to kill him before he comes near. So we have a little bit of a change. Obviously there was an attempt to assassinate Paul or to kill Paul back in 22 when the riot broke out, and the tribune had to step in and to remove Paul to take him to the barracks. So it hasn't died down. Here we are probably about 24 hours later. There's now people that have gone so far, and they say there's 40 of them. They make a vow not to eat. They're going to, a vow of fasting or what have you, that they're now wanting to hatch a plan in order to assassinate Paul. Notice that there's 40 of them. And now some will say it's 40 and that's a biblical number, and 40 is a biblical number for complete or wholeness. So whether or not it's a literal 40 people or not, it's a number of folks. 40, it says 40. I think it's a good, you can kind of lean in that it's 40 people. I think it's 40 people, not to prove that this is a whole number, as in a complete number, that 40 is used often in other times in the Bible. I think it's 40 people because in order to assassinate Paul, who would have been under Roman guard care back in 22, when the tribune stepped in to calm the riot and to bring some level of order, the tribune did not know if Paul was a citizen. Near the end of chapter 22, he discovered that Paul was a citizen. Now, by Roman law, the tribune now is tasked with protecting Paul because that's part of his citizenship. So I think the reason why there's 40 people listed in the text is because in order to assassinate Paul, if that plan were to take place, a number of those would have to engage the Roman guards, and many of them would die. So there's a number of Jews, this particular zealots, who are wanting to kill Paul, and the reason why it's a number of folks is because it's going to take a number of folks in order to do it. So we have a little bit of what's going on now outside of the scope of Paul. We get some insight into what's going on inside of Jerusalem. So let's keep going. Now we're going to look at verses 16 through 22. Now the son of Paul's sister heard of their ambush, so he went and entered the barracks and told Paul. Paul called one of the centurions and said, "Take this young man to the tribune, for he has something to tell him." So he took him and brought him to the tribune and said, "Paul, the prisoner, called me and asked me to bring this young man to you, as he has something to say to you." The tribune took him by the hand and, going aside, asked him privately, "What is it that you have to tell me?" And he, being the nephew or the young boy, said, "The Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down to the council tomorrow, as though they were going to inquire somewhat more closely about him. But do not be persuaded by them, for more than 40 of their men are lying in ambush for him, who have bound themselves by an oath neither to eat nor drink till they have killed him. And now they are ready, waiting for your consent." So the tribune dismissed the young man, charging him, "Tell no one that you have informed me of these things." Now, on one level, if we step back and we look at this text maybe from, say, 100 meters, this is sort of a nice little coincidence for Paul. We don't know much about Paul's life at all, and now all of a sudden Paul's nephew is here. And so one of the questions that often people ask when they look at this particular portion of Acts chapter 23 is, this is the right time. Does this just happen to be fortuitous that nephew is it for Paul because nephew's in the right time, right place at the right time? Or is this somehow, God is sort of in the middle of all this, particularly going back to verse 11 when Paul is told in some level of a vision or some type of ecstasy, prayer moment or something that where Jesus came to him and said, "You're going to testify for me in Rome." I like what William Temple, archbishop of just about everything, I think, in England for a while. He said this about this particular passage. He said, when I pray, and he's leaving the text and just talking about his own life and how coincidence and things like that. He says, when I pray, coincidences happen. When I stop praying, coincidences stop happening. And so there's something to this. I mean, that, it's John Wesley would tell you that there are no such thing as chance or coincidence, that all things are by the hand of God, and that on something like this, that it's not just happened to be at the right place at the right time, as much as this is some level of direction by God in the lives of people. So you can sort of kind of make your own conclusions. I think it's interesting that he just happened to be there at the right time, and that's not something that was by chance, but something that God perhaps was moving in the life of the people. Now, one question that we ask is, who is Paul's nephew? We don't get much insight from Paul, about his life. Paul tells us in Philippians chapter 3 that he's basically suffered all things for Christ. And what he meant by that, he's suffered loss, that he's lost all things for Christ. What most people believe about Paul is that obviously his family, at least for one generation, maybe multiple generations, were very strict Jews. They were some level tied, whether or not his dad or his granddad was some level of a Pharisee. Now, Pharisees date back long before Jesus, so you're looking at the Pharisees come to sort of rise in the intertestamental period between the Old Testament and New Testament. It was a number of centuries there, and the Pharisees, the whole order came out of when they didn't want to reinvent their past and some of the past mistakes, so they double down on the obedient to the law, and it's lay people, it's not clergy, and really sort of impose that upon the society, as if to say, we're going to legislate morality so that people don't make any mistakes, because if they made mistakes in the past, which led to their captivities. So we don't know to what level Paul's family were actually Pharisees. We do know that Paul's family agreed with the Pharisee mindset. So maybe they're, whether or not they're actually considered a Pharisee per se or just Pharisaic, to some degree it doesn't matter. But we know that was part of Paul's life. It was part of Paul. When we first meet Paul in Acts, he is very much a zealous Pharisee, or at least adopted their ways and very zealous about that. For Paul to become a Christian would basically take everything that was a part of Paul formerly that would be sacrificed. He would have been disinherited for his acceptance and proclamation of Jesus as the Messiah. Many think that he was married and maybe had a family, and that his family, not just his larger family like parents, but that his own individual family divorced, disinherited him. We do know that his father was a citizen of Tarsus, which would have meant some level of means for his family. So Paul, his family, we don't know to what level of wealth they acquired, but in order to be a citizen, number one, a citizen came with some level of financial benefits inside the Roman Empire. At the same time, you had to have some level of wealth to maintain a life of a citizen. So we can conclude that Paul's family had some level of wealth. We also can conclude that all that was either disinherited or Paul, forsook all that for Christ. So there was obviously some level of division. However, we do know that maybe there is at least someone in Paul's family, Paul's sister. We don't know her name, or at least we're not told her name. She does have at least one child. We know him from the text. And that perhaps she retained some level of affection for him regardless of their family situation. And perhaps, now this is some speculation, we don't know for sure, at some point the level of affection, or at least, Paul was not dead to the nephew. And so the nephew, we don't know if he lived in Jerusalem. We don't know if he's down with his family at the festival. Remember, when Paul, in chapter 22, Paul came to Jerusalem not just to deliver an offering, but Paul came to Jerusalem because it was also one of the major festivals, the Festival of Weeks. So it could be that they were down. Because whenever there was a major festival, and there were about 7 of them throughout the year, people would travel in from Israel to make it to Jerusalem for the week-long celebration. That was an aspect of their worship. They didn't have worship the way, where you kind of mixed in prayer and all this. And, worship was during these festivals. You also had daily prayers, and then you had a time where you would come and sacrifice. That made up the worship. They didn't always line up on the same time, like it would be for us, say, 11 o'clock or 9 o'clock or 8:30 on a Sunday morning. So what most people think, and I'm in agreement with this, that some degree of Paul's family was probably in Jerusalem for the celebration. The majority of the family has nothing to do with Paul, hasn't had anything to do with Paul for a number of years, but at least there was some level of affection, maybe through a sister, from that her son. And the son hears about what's going on, that there's a plot to kill Paul, and obviously he informed Paul. Paul then informed, or at least sent him to the tribune. The tribune catches wind of the plot, and so now he's going to act to safeguard Paul from this. For this reason. So understand what's going on just logically. The tribune now is tasked with caring for Roman citizens. That was part of their job. And so now that he was informed that Paul was a citizen, he cannot just turn his back on Paul. He has to make sure that Paul is safe, because that was Paul's right as a citizen. Knowing that there's an assassination plot, the tribune either has to act to dispel the assassination plot, which in doing that probably would have caused a greater riot. So what he's going to do is he's going to move Paul to a different place, to a higher governor, under that governor's protection. And so that's what we have in verse 23 through 24. So let's look at that real quick. Then he called 2 centurions. Now, he being the tribune, called 2 centurions and said, get ready to, listen to the amount of people too, 200 soldiers with 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen to go as far as Caesarea at the 3rd hour of the night. Also provide mounts for Paul to ride and to bring him safely to Felix, the governor, as he wrote this to a letter. We're going to save verse 25. Just notice the amount of people that the tribune could not afford for an assassination of a Roman citizen. That would have been a major mark against the tribune, might even led to his eviction from office. So he is tasked with caring for the Roman citizen, who is Paul. And this is a pretty large group of people. You got hundreds of people. Some of them are, spearmen. Some of them are cavalry, and they're going to pass Paul. So if you can just think about the map of Jerusalem. Now, this isn't a map to scale. To some degree, we can move this out. Jerusalem would still, Israel would kind of go on down a little bit more. But so they're in Jerusalem, and this is Jericho. This is the Dead Sea. Some of you were in Israel not too long ago, and so you can kind of imagine that. Sea of Galilee's way up here, this area right here. And so they're going to go from Jerusalem. The text is going to make some level of a stop right here. It's going to tell us about this. Antipatris is where they're going to stop. And then eventually they want to go to Caesarea, because Felix is the governor there. And he's sort of like the regional guy out of Caesarea. If you think back to your gospel lessons, particularly in the Gospel of Luke, where you have a time where Jesus is traveling, and I think they go to Caesarea, and there's there's where Jesus sends the pigs into the lake. Caesarea had a garrison. I mean, Caesarea is a Greek city, and it was known to have a garrison for Rome. So it was a Greek area. It was a military place, and so it's fitting that the governor. Now, don't think Governor Pilate. Think that there's someone who would be there to be sort of an area person. It's also close to the sea, which meant that it would have been easy for people to come from Rome. So that's where they're going. And notice that they left under strong guard. They leave basically in the middle of the night. This is basically the tribune is trying to get Paul out of Jerusalem as fast as possible, because it seems to be that the climate is rising, and he's charged with keeping the peace and the protection of Roman citizens. So let's pick it up, verse 25. We'll go through verse 30, and you're going to get the letter that is accompanied with the soldiers and with Paul to Felix. So beginning in verse 25, and he wrote a letter to this effect: Claudius Lysias. Now, Lysias is the name of the tribune. It's interesting that Luke doesn't put his name until now. We've been dealing with this guy for a couple of chapters, but that's who it is, Claudius Lysias. To His Excellency the Governor Felix, greeting. This man was seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them when I came upon them with the soldiers and rescued him. Having learned that he was a Roman citizen and desiring to know the charge for which they were accusing him, I brought him down to the council. I found that he was being accused about questions of their law, but charged with nothing deserving death or imprisonment. And when it was disclosed to me that that there would be a plot against the man, I sent him to you at once, ordering his accuser also to state before you what they have against him. Now, there's a couple of things that are interesting here. If we were to go back and compare this to chapter 22, Lysias doesn't mention anything about ordering him to be flogged. Remember how the Roman centurions discovered that Paul was a citizen? Lysias rescued Paul from they seized Paul. They shut part of the gate from maybe the court of the women into the court of the men in the temple. The tribune, Lysias, stepped in with centurions. They take Paul from him. Paul addresses the crowd. It did not work. Eventually have to move him to the barracks for his own protection. And then Lysias, the tribune, instructed the centurions to flog him, thinking that in the beatings that somehow they would get to the truth, because he felt like he wasn't getting the truth from the mob and he didn't get it from Paul. That's when Paul revealed that he was a Roman citizen, which then has led to this idea that now the tribune has to protect Paul. But notice that's not in this letter, because it would have been actually against the law to even assign that to a citizen. So to some degree, Lysias is sort of cleaning it up a little bit to make him look better than what it actually is. But he's moved Paul out of danger here, now up to here under Felix. And Felix would be, he's the larger area, regional area governor here, and they left in the middle of the night in order to protect Paul. Now, here's what I also want us to think about. When we think about Paul's life, and so we can, larger than just Acts chapter 23, when we think about Paul's life, we see that we would classify Paul as having an obedient life, a faithful life, and yet his life is filled with pain and struggle for the gospel. Not just here, but if you go back and think about when he was in Thessalonica, when he was in Athens a little bit, in Corinth a little bit, in Ephesians a little bit. I mean, the only time that it really was just really easy was when he was with Philippi. But the other places that he traveled, beaten a couple of times, in prison multiple times. I mean, this is not a life that is filled with, um, with ease. And so I think it's important for us, at least when it comes to our expectation, when it comes to the gospel, we shouldn't imagine that we get a free pass because we're Christians. I mean, actually, I would say you probably put yourself in a place where you might even invite persecution. Not that you desire it, but if we take Paul's life and some of the other people in the Bible, their life, we shouldn't imagine that things or people should leave us alone. That they will not challenge us for what we believe or what we are doing or how we are living, and how our faith intersects with the public world. To some degree, when we think about our life, we have to think about the levels of Christ and how that interplays with the culture. Now, there's going to be times when that is easy, maybe where it will feel like the wind is at your back, but often it will not. Because what Christ requires of you, and it's not just an ask or a should, this is a shall. Christ requires a level of obedience that affects every aspect of your life. So it calls for you to live a pretty strict moral code. You have to forgive. You have to love. I mean, you can go back and look at some of the passages where Jesus, even on the Sermon on the Mount and other from his own example about how he lived and then what he preached. I mean, the idea of turning the other cheek, the idea that if one person asks you to go 1 mile, you go 2. If they want your tunic, you give them your cloak. I mean, so there's all types of moral, ethical demands that's required of the Christian. But you have to live with kingdom values, which means there are many things you can do, but there are some things that you cannot that others in society say you can. Well, the reason why you don't is because you're asked to live differently because of your faith. So there's a moral component. There's a operational component. I mean, what I mean by operation, that's sort of a technical term. Again, you're not asked to serve. You're commanded to serve. You're not asked to witness. You're commanded to witness. And so there's these levels of what it means to be connected to Christ. And all this is assumed in the Bible that this is what the Christian is, and therefore that's what the Christian does. It's not open for debate. I mean, it's not one of those things that, well, if it's easy, I'll do it. To some degree, the Bible is a record of where it doesn't matter what your environment is, you're called to be and to live a certain way, regardless of the circumstances around you, regardless of your situation. I mean, you're required to love, you're required to serve, you're required to live a disciplined life, which means that you take on certain levels of disciplines as they're self-imposed. You live a simpler life. You live, why? So that you can be freed up to do the other things. You live a life that restricts your time because some of your time you gladly give over to God. It's not something that we should begrudge as if to say, woe is me, I've got to go down and punch my card on God's time clock. We gladly do these things because we want to be connected to Christ. But it will put us at odds with the surrounding culture in some form or fashion. I mean, it's his rules, not mine. So if you don't like it, you can take it up with him. I think he's available at 11:31 for a time of prayer. If you're, I'm being a little tongue in cheek here, but what we find in the Bible when the Bible gives us insight into other early Christians, how they lived their life, it was not dependent upon whether or not it should be easy or not. They they cast their lots this way, or they set to sail this way, and regardless of what comes, it doesn't matter. And so when Paul in Philippians talked about sacrificing all, or all things being lost, or giving up things just for the knowledge of knowing Christ, what Paul is saying is this is far greater, even if it's not easy, than something else, because in the end, this is who I know. And it's something that we have to be reminded of. Because many people today inside the church, when things either stack up against them or it becomes more difficult for them, we have a tendency to internalize them and to see this as maybe working against us. And the truth is that's separate than what it means when it comes to our faith. Our faith is something that we are a part of, who we are, what we do, what happens to us because of this. Different question. And so you see it in Paul. I mean, verse 11 says, you're going to be a witness for me in Rome, just like you were in Jerusalem. This is the third time God conveyed that to him. And yet his life becomes just one event after the other, that if we didn't know anything about faith and we're just reading the book of Acts and evaluating it just at face value with what happened to Paul, there'd be part of us that say, man, this guy's a glutton for punishment. And he can't stay out of it. Well, so you step back and you go, well, what is this really saying? Is Paul one who seeks after just hardship? No. Because then when we also look at the greater scope of the Bible, the whole canon, the whole view of the Bible, what we find is that Paul is just one of many that hook their trailer to Christ, and regardless of what comes their way, that's, to some degree, it's immaterial. It doesn't matter whether or not it's green pastures or whether or not it's the valley of the shadow of death. For the Bible, for what the Bible teaches us about Christians, this is what we're after. And this becomes the pearl of great price, or the field of immense value, to the point that we're willing to let go of everything else just to obtain that. And so you see it here. I mean, Paul ends up in prison for at least 2 years, just from this. And the whole time he's just waiting for his court case, and there's multiple times that he sort of entertains that. And this is verse 11, chapter 23, it takes about 2.5, almost 3 years for fulfillment. He doesn't just, I turn the page and I go from 24 to 28, and in 28 he's going to Rome. No, it's years in the making. So there is something to us sort of seeing who we are as a follower of Christ, and what we do because we are a follower of Christ, that we gladly do, but that's independent of how we will be perceived. So there might be times where we're perceived where it's easy and good, and then there might be times where it's not. But that's not open for discussion, at least when it comes to the Bible. So we now keep on reading. So verse 31, so the soldiers, according to their instruction, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. And on the next day they returned to the barracks, letting the horsemen go. So some of the soldiers take him up to this place, and then they stop, and they go back, and then others end up taking him to Caesarea, finishing the job. And on the next day they returned to the barracks, letting the horsemen go on with him. When they had come to Caesarea and delivered the letter to the governor, they presented Paul also before him. On reading the letter, he asked what province he was from, and when he learned that he was from Seleucia, he said, I will give you a hearing when your accusers arrive. And he commanded him to be guarded in Herod's praetorium. All right, so we come to the end of at least chapter 23. I want to tell you a little bit about Felix before we move into chapter 24. Felix was actually born a slave. So many people who end up either being in the Roman bureaucracy of government or of leadership, or even in Rome, in the Roman Empire itself, because not everybody that was under the Roman rule were citizens. The majority of them were not. Now, the way you became a citizen, you could purchase your citizenship. You could be born up from, of a citizen, like the family of it, so then that would make you a citizen. Or you could perform some act, as the emperor might say, if you serve in the army for X amount of time, and once your subscription or conscription is over, then you're free. You can be you're a citizen. So Felix was born a slave, but was given he and his brother Pallius were given their freedom. They did something for Emperor Claudius. We're not 100% sure what they did, but Claudius, like some of the other previous emperors, they would put people in office, like in junior positions, that they knew, or he knew, that they were going to be loyal to him. So Claudius placed Felix in this position as governor because he knew that Felix and his brother definitely were going to be grateful for Claudius's benevolence, and that would at least then Claudius the emperor could trust Felix. So he was governor of a large region. This was like 52 A.D., but he only lasted about 6 years, and the reason why is because under his leadership, it was checkered with all types of riots in the region, mainly because Felix was incredibly brutal. And so whenever there was some level of uprising in his province, he would brutally squash the rebellion. And what that did is that just fueled the fire for more and more rebellious activity. You can go in people of, I think Josephus, who's a first century historian, said he exercised the power of a king with the mind of a slave. And he constantly fanned the flame of discontent. Now, what kept him in office as long as he was able to hold the office was his brother. His brother was actually pretty good friends with the emperor, and so he was able to run cover for him. But once Emperor Claudius was removed and a new emperor takes over the reins, Nero would be next, obviously his brother didn't have the same clout with the emperor, so Felix's star, it crashed and burned fairly quickly. Felix was married 3 times. Each time he was married to royalty. His first wife was the granddaughter of Mark Antony and Cleopatra. His third wife was a lady by the name of Drusilla, who was the youngest daughter of Herod Agrippa. Now, you might remember go back to earlier parts of Acts, and you'll go back and sort of dust off Herod Agrippa. So he had a position of power. With that, he was able to sort of increase that through marriages. But in the end, he's removed from office for his level of brutality. All right, so let's keep on going into 24. We have about 30 minutes left. Maybe we can get through all of chapter 24. So what we're going to do in 24 is we'll pick up with, now Paul has moved from Jerusalem to Caesarea, so there's a geographical shift. Let's look at verses 1 through 9. Yep, 1 through 9. After 5 days, the high priest Ananias came down. Notice that it says came down. Now, what he means by that, even though the high priest would have been in Jerusalem, it seems like he's going up. But Jerusalem is up on a hill or a mountain, so in the Bible, whenever it refers to Jerusalem, you go up to Jerusalem even if you're traveling south. Even if you're going north, you go down from Jerusalem just because of where it was. Not just geographically, but some of it is just denotes that Jerusalem as the holy place. After 5 days, the high priest Ananias came down with some soldiers and a spokesman, one Tertullus. They laid before the governor their case against Paul, and when he had summoned Tertullus, began to accuse him, saying, now this right here is going to be here the prosecutor. Tertullus was a special prosecutor that was brought by the high priest, and so this is his case, or at least a summary of his case. Since through you we enjoy much peace, and since by your foresight, most excellent Felix, reforms are being made for this nation. Now, I just gave you the history of Felix, and he was fairly brutal. So some of this is sort of playing up to the governor. In every way and in everywhere we accept this with all gratitude. And that's just a flat-out lie. But to detain you no further, I beg you in your kindness to hear us briefly. Jews in Jerusalem did not receive Roman rule with gratitude. So, I mean, you can see some of this, what it's kind of tipping the hand. For we have found this man a plague. Now, some of your Bibles might say a pest. Some of your Bibles might say a disturber, a sinister person. I mean, that's a pretty interesting word there. But we have found this man a plague, one who stirs up riots among all the Jews throughout the world, and is the ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. So we get two insights into what they're accusing Paul of. One, he's a plague. Two, he's a ringleader. He even tried to profane the temple. Three, that's the third one, but we seized him. By examining him yourself, you will be able to find out from him about everything of which we accused him. The Jews also joined in the charge, affirming that all these things were so. So it's 5 days since the centurions safeguarded Paul to Caesarea. Felix summoned the high priest, so the high priest brought a special prosecutor. They give this threefold indictment. One, that Paul was a pest or a plague. The word implies sinister implications. And with it would be a hint of treason. I mean, so it's a pretty powerful indictment here about Paul. And the word also implies that this was a habitual action on behalf of Paul. Now what's interesting to me, and I think this is what Luke is doing here inside of the passage, he's going to give us insight into what, at least, either from Herod Agrippa we're going to get to the second, or from Felix and eventually Festus, about what their thoughts are of Paul, and I think you can make a conclusion about what their thoughts are of early Christians. And so I think Luke is sort of giving us insight from Paul's life, maybe as a microcosm for what other people thought or how they viewed different Christians. So first word of indictment is he's a plague or a pest. The next one is that he's the leader of the Nazarenes. Now, we don't really know exactly what that means. We can draw a conclusion that in some form this is connected, that he's a follower of Christ, that he's preaching that. Now, keep in mind, this is probably 20 plus years from the time of Jesus. So, I mean, it's not just Jesus died, resurrected, and then we get just a few. I mean, we've got a couple of decades since Jesus was on the scene. But obviously, this sect of Nazarenes, what we're also seeing here is early on, right? So go back and think, and this is why Acts is so important. Go back and think about Acts. In the beginning, Peter, James, and John, the disciples, and even Paul, where did they go first to preach the gospel? They went to the synagogue. And so then if the synagogue received that, then they would continue there. If not, then eventually they moved to the Gentiles. Now, it took an act of God to get Peter to not go to the synagogue, but to actually go to Cornelius' house. But even when Paul was in his travels in all the different cities, the Greek cities, he would go to the synagogue first. This was his modus operandi, how he operated. And if it went, if everything uh, was okay and went well, then he would stay in the synagogue. But if not, then he would go to the Gentiles to preach. Barnabas was really the one who just kind of went straight out into the Gentiles. But early on, and even up until probably a few chapters ago, Paul would engage first in the synagogue, and then he would go to the Greeks. But from a Roman perspective, what they considered in the beginning, they saw Christianity as just a subsect of Judaism. But here, you're starting to see a divergence that, and by the end of the first century, there's people don't conclude that Christians are Jews or they're all part of the same family. There's by the end of the first century, there is this division from the Roman mind between the two. But in the beginning, they saw them come, part of the same household. Just, this one lived on this room and this one lived in that room. So you're starting to see a little bit of divergence from the Roman perspective. Luke has given us insight here into the connection between Jews and Christians. And then the last indictment is that he profaned the temple. Now, for the high priest and special prosecutor, this is the most the most important indictment. This is the one that is most serious to them. But from a Roman perspective, this is not. And actually, it would be hard to prove in a Roman court because to some degree, Rome didn't care about what was going on in those individual religions and their different religious practices, as long as they kept the peace and as long as they gave some homage to the emperor and paid their taxes. So we get insight into what's going on through the special prosecutor. So that's the case that is laid out before them. So let's look at Paul's defense. And we're going to go from verse 10 all the way down to verse 21. And when the governor had nodded to him to speak, that is Paul replied, "Knowing that for many years you have been a judge over this nation, I cheerfully make my defense. You can verify this. It is not more than 12 days since I went up to worship in Jerusalem. And they did not find me disputing with anyone or stirring up a crowd, either in the temple or in the synagogue or in the city. Neither can they prove to you what they now bring up against me. But this I confess to you, that according to the way," it's interesting there, "which they call a sect," so then we get some insight into what does it mean about the Nazarenes, "I worship the God of our fathers, believing everything laid down by the law and written in the prophets, having a hope in God, with these men themselves accept that there will be a resurrection of both the just and the unjust." Now I want you to put a pin right here because this is fairly important with what Paul is saying here. Verse 16, "So I always take pains to have a clear conscience towards both God and man and people. Now after several years I came to bring alms to my nation and to present offering. While I was doing this, they found me purified in the temple without any crowd or tumult. But some Jews from Asia," Paul identifying the issue, "they ought to be here before you and to make an accusation should they have anything against me. Or else let these men themselves say what wrongdoing they found when I stood before the council, other than the one thing that I cried out while standing among them. It is with respect to the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial before you today." So we have Paul's defense here before Felix. Now he explained it had been 5 years, a number of years since he last visited Jerusalem. What's interesting with Paul's defense is that he is fairly logical. He told Felix, "This is what I didn't do, but here's what I did do." And this is the only place in Paul's writing where he talked about the resurrection of the righteous and the unrighteous, or the resurrection of the just and the unjust. It's not the only time he talks about resurrection, because there's time where he talks about resurrection all throughout, pretty much every epistle. But what's unique here is he actually gives you some insight that it's resurrection of unjust and just, or unrighteous and righteous. This is the only time it shows up under Paul's writing. Again, he talks about resurrection of the dead, but it's not defined like it is here, where you have both something positive and something negative at the same time. He gives you insight into why he came to Jerusalem in the first place, going back to chapter 22, and that is to bring an offering. Now, what's interesting to me is that Luke doesn't go into detail about whether or not the offering hit the target. I mean, you can read some of the other epistles of Paul, and you find that Paul mentions levels of thanksgiving and gratitude for those churches taking an offering for the Jerusalem church, but you don't get any insight into how effective it was. Now, the book of James tells us that there was a famine about the time, similar to this time, and so the Hebrew church, the Jerusalem church, was suffering greatly, but we just don't get any insight from Luke about whether or not it was effective or not. Also, the offering was given by Gentile churches, given to a predominantly Jewish church. Perhaps the idea of some of the early church leaders in prescribing an offering or asking for an offering was to try to bring the house together between Jew and Gentile Christians, but we're just not sure how effective that it was. Verse 18 and 19, Paul defined himself saying that he performed the purification vow. We already know that from chapter 22, in an orderly fashion, and that he did that in such a way so that he would not incite any riotous behavior on behalf of the Jewish population. So we get insight into, Paul, what I really appreciate about Paul is Paul does not hide from the truth, whether he's telling his own testimony or whether or not he's given insight either into what he didn't do or what he did do. And I think that's obviously something for us to take into our own life. All right, let's keep going, verses 22 through 23. But Felix, having a rather accurate knowledge of accurate knowledge of the way, put them off, saying, when Lysias the tribune comes down, I will decide your case. Then he gave orders to the centurion that he should be kept in custody, but to have some liberties, and that none of his friends should be prevented from attending to his needs. Again, Paul is afforded the normal benefits of a citizen. Citizens under any level of arrest did have the ability, they were sort of like have an ankle bracelet, and you could only travel, you had to stay within a certain area, but you could receive guests and things of that nature. What many people believe, that is scholars or first century theologians or what have you, believe that Felix is slow playing his hand. We really don't know if Lysias actually came down to Caesarea, or if just his letter was all the information that he sent, and that letter would be sufficient. But to some degree, Felix saw through the case and realized that the indictments would not hold water. But he did not rule and let Paul go because he wanted to manage the Jerusalem area in a way that it wouldn't incite greater riots when it came to Paul. Other people also believe that at this time his brother, who used to be the cover for him with the emperor, that perhaps his brother is falling out of favor with the new emperor. And so Felix definitely wants to mind his P's and Q's and just in his leadership, so that he stays off the radar screen, because he wants to keep his position with the new emperor, who would be Nero. Now, we don't know for sure, just know some level of that he did not act. You get indication from the text that the case does not hold water, but for whatever reason, he didn't do it. So let's keep going if we can. Let's see how much time we got. We have about 15 minutes, so I think we can keep going. So let's move now into verse 24, And let's go down through 26, which would be the end of the chapter. And that might be about as far as we can get, or 27, excuse me. Um, After some days, Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish, and he sent for Paul and heard him speak about faith in Christ Jesus. And as he reasoned about righteousness and self-control and the coming judgment, Felix was alarmed and said, Go away for the present. When I get an opportunity, I will summon you." At the same time, he hoped that money would be given him by Paul, so that he sent for him often and conversed with him. When 2 years had elapsed, Felix was succeeded by Porticus Festus, and desiring to do the Jews a favor, Felix left him in prison. All right, so we come to the end of chapter 24, but it's there's some things that we want to pay attention to, and that is that when in verse 24 we get some insight into Paul's conversation with Felix. And it's centered around, even though we don't have the specifics, we do get some insight into what was, at least what was in that conversation. And that is the gospel has ethical implications, and that we can't dismiss it. I mean, now Luke names a few, that it's about righteousness, it's about self-control, and about the coming judgment. Now again, those are just maybe headings, but at least tells you the tenor of what their conversation was like. And again, to go back to this right here, that when it comes to the gospel has implications for the type of person you will be and the type of actions that you will commit. You are to love God with all your heart. You are to love your neighbor as yourself. Well, I mean, what does that look like to love God? Well, that shows up in your actions. To love your neighbor as yourself. What does that look like? That'll show up in your actions. And both of those are incredibly radical when you compare that to the average life inside of a time or a culture. So again, you see that Paul, at least Luke records for us, some level of understanding of this, not just Jesus' death and resurrection, but now in the preaching, it goes from Jesus' death and resurrection into what does that look like in application to our life? And that is that not only we are a follower of a way, but we live the way as well. And then we know Luke gives us a summary statement that Felix eventually is removed from office. The next governor is a guy by the name of Festus, and Paul is in prison for at least 2 years. Again, verse 11, Jesus said, "You're going to be a witness in Rome, just like you were for me in Jerusalem." He hasn't even left Caesarea yet, and he's been in prison for 2 years, and yet has not been any movement on his case. And we go from one governor to the next. Now, as you would imagine, when we get into chapter 25 next week, that it's going to have to start all over because you have a new governor, and how's that governor going to react with the people in Jerusalem? That's always a level of contention for Roman rule, and the fact that even 2 years later, there's still a burning desire to kill Paul. So we're going to save that for next week. We have a few moments, maybe.
You also have an extra 15 minutes if you need it. But the question from Betty is, could you talk to us about living this life of Christ without being seen as a Jesus freak or a goody two shoes? How also do we avoid becoming prideful?
All right, so normally what we do is we have about 10, 12 minutes left. We want to open it up for questions. So we do have one question, and the question is, could I say a little more about what it means to be a follower of Christ without being considered a Jesus freak or a goody two shoes, or just maybe some different slang terms, or to even become prideful in the fact that we are followers of the way? So we have two different. It's kind of a compound question. So I'll tackle the first one. The first one is, how do we follow Christ in a way to where the style of life that is required of a Christian is going to put us in a category to where we're either Jesus freak, zealot, or radical religious person, things like that. to some degree, it comes with the territory. Now, what I mean by that is it is impossible in order to not be seen as a Jesus freak, because to be a Christian, you're a Jesus freak. All right? So in order to not be seen as a Jesus freak, what we're really thinking about is how does the surrounding culture see Christians? Now, they might or might not see you as a Jesus freak. Now, whether or not they do or they do not should not be, that should not, to some degree, it doesn't matter. I mean, as a follower of Christ, you're first and foremost, you're a follower of Christ. Now, if in following Christ in faithfulness, that puts you at odds with the surrounding culture so that you would be classified by the culture as a Jesus freak, to some degree, that's to what level does the culture embrace general principles of Christianity. If they do, if that's part of their society, then you're less likely to be considered a Jesus freak. But if you are in a culture that is anti-Christian, or where it's a culture that opposes Christianity or any aspect of not just Christianity, religion, things of that nature, then to some degree that's just par for the course. It comes with the territory. So now, if we talk about how we live our life in the form of a witness, to where we're going to be yelling and screaming that people are going to hell, if that's what you mean by Jesus freak, then that's a different question, because you're talking about methodology of evangelism. But to live your life in humility as a follower of Christ, where you're commanded to love people, and so you orchestrate your life around that, which means there's going to be levels of forgiveness. There's going to be levels of reconciliation. You don't have to do those things according to this. According to this, you have to do those things. So much of this is it's interpersonal. It's what's going on inside of you, and then to some degree relational, vertical relationship with you and Christ. So there's a degree that you orchestrate your life to be a follower of the first, according to the ethical, moral, operational demands of the gospel. To serve, okay? You serve because that's who you are, whether or not the culture thinks that's valuable. Now, we can talk about there are things in the culture that they do see as valuable. I mean, servant leadership. Let me tell you, that's been around for a long time. It actually dates back to Jesus as a servant leader, all right? Well, the culture likes that, but they didn't come up with that. I mean, this has been around for 2,000 years, loving, caring, things like that, definitely characteristics, fruits of the spirits when it comes to a Christian. Culture identifies with that. But to whether or not it agrees or disagrees, that to some degree is beyond your control. Now, the idea of goody two-shoes, you will have to restrict your life that according to some, you live with moderation. You live with restrictions. There's certain things you just don't do because one, you can't do them, or you observe not to do them out of respect and care for a surrounding group. Now that still you might be seen as goody two-shoes. To some degree, that's going to be determined by the culture that you live in. And but whether or not they see you that way shouldn't be a prerequisite, as if to see you in a positive light, on whether or not you follow here. You follow here first. If that puts you as a Jesus freak or a goody two-shoes, then that's unfortunate, but that is something that you can't control. Now, as for the idea of becoming prideful, I think that helps you not become seen as a Jesus freak if the culture stands against, or as a goody two-shoes, because what you don't find inside the Bible, or at least you might find it, but it's not promoted. And so whenever there are Christians in the Old Testament, or there are followers of God in the Old Testament, New Testament, who out of their faith develop a sense of pride, and it always ends poorly for them. So even though it might be recorded in the Bible, it is not highlighted as acceptable in the Bible. Part of what this means to be a Christian does come with the level of the high road. I mean, and Paul's a perfect example in Acts chapter 22, where he takes the high road morally, theologically. I mean, the fact that he was willing to pay for himself and others to take the purification vow to help the community, that gives you insight for what it means to be a Christian. And that is that you live with a life of humility. And so even if people step on your humility or seek to still do things ill will or whatever it may be against you, again, you cannot control that, but you can establish what type of person you're going to be. That sits within your control with working with the Holy Spirit, and you can establish how you're going to respond to whatever comes your way. So I hope that clears it up. I'll give you a second or two if there's something that's still not clear, or if there's another question. So to avoid becoming prideful, what I would say is that's an inward disposition. And so the best thing to do is to think about the grace of God. The fact that St. Augustine said it beautifully, and it's been quoted for ages. Looking at someone else, and in this particular case, someone who did not have the best reputation, there but by the grace of God go I. And so you can try to interpret that to be like the Pharisee with the tax collector in the temple, where the tax collector is beating his chest, and you go, oh my gosh, thanks for the grace of God, I'm not like this guy. Or you actually can say, if it was not, you actually can take the heart, if it wasn't for the grace of God, there really is no hope for me, regardless of anybody else. So humility is how you see yourself, has nothing to do with how you see another person. So if you see yourself in light of the grace of God, then in my experience, what I think that would lead to is that'll lead you to a posture of being on your knees. And it's hard to be prideful when you're on your knees.
She said thanks. It was effectiveness and evangelism that she was thinking about.
Sure. All right, I think we're out of time, or about to be, within about another minute. And so we're going to pick up, again, next week, just to kind of keep you in the loop. We're going to pick up chapter 25, and we're probably going to try to run all the way through 26. So we're going to look at doing both chapters if you want to read ahead, because that Paul is still in Caesarea, but by the end of chapter 26, he's making his way in 27 and 28 to Rome. So next week, 25, 26, week after 27, 28, and we should be finished with the book of Acts. God bless you. Hope you have a good week, and we hope to see you soon.